First appearing in toy stores in 1964, G.I. Joe is an American pop culture icon that has inspired 3 different generations of collectors. Over the last 55 years, G.I. Joe has continually broken new ground in the toy market, appeared in different action figure scales, and has even had his own comic book, cartoon, and 2 blockbuster Hollywood movies. G.I. Joe was one of the top-selling boys' toys of the 1960s, the 70s, and the 80s, and the brand now boasts a legion of over 500 different characters. Throughout his reign, G.I. Joe was always the toughest toy on the block, a toy that captured our youthful imaginations and is now considered the most collected toy in the world. Starting out his life as the world's very first posable action figure, G.I. Joe was forced to evolve several times over his illustrious career, and his consistent reinvention has all but ensured his status as an action figure legend. Hello toy fans, my name is Tony and welcome to an Analog Toys special feature. Toy Histories with G.I. Joe, the world's very first action figure. The history of the G.I. Joe toy line starts in 1963 in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where a man named Stan Weston proposed the concept of a 12-inch tall soldier doll with removable uniforms to Don Levine, who was creative director at the Hasbro toy company, a company that first saw wide commercial success with their Mr. Potato Head toy. Well aware of Mattel's amazing success with the popular Barbie doll, Don Levine believed that Stan Weston's military-themed concept could translate across to the boys' toy market, and after spying an artist posable wooden mannequin in an art supply store, Don quickly realised that the success of this new doll for boys may lay in a child's ability to pose the figure. However, Hasbro's senior management had concerns over selling a doll for boys. After all, the parental attitudes of the 1960s might not have welcomed the idea. Seemingly undeterred, Don Levine assembled a team of artists and designers and set about developing a number of prototype figures. And in order to avoid the stigma of a doll for boys, they banned everyone in the company from using the term doll and coined the phrase action figure. These prototypes were modelled after the main US military branches of World War II and were initially named Rocky the Marine, Skip the Sailor, and Ace the Fighter Pilot. However, these different names would not be suitable when selling the overall brand concept. What was needed was a singular title that would encapsulate the essence of the brand. So as luck would have it, Don Levine was watching his television one night when the movie The Story of G.I. Joe starring Robert Mitchum appeared on the screen, and he quickly realised that this was the iconic name he'd been looking for all along. In addition to the name G.I. Joe, Don also wanted to trademark the figure in some way, so he decided to give G.I. Joe a battle scar on his right cheek, and this little design touch has now become famously synonymous with the G.I. Joe brand. After several weeks of development, Don Levine's design team was ready to show off their G.I. Joe mock-ups to Hasbro's management. The original presentation included the action soldiers, the action sailors, the action marines, and the action pilots. However, Hasbro's management were concerned about the costs involved in producing figures and outfits for all 4 services, and suggested that the company only move forward with the manufacture of the action soldier line. Don Levine was concerned that if Hasbro only produced the action soldiers, other companies would want to cash in by producing their own versions of the Marines, sailors, and pilots. "Leave no flank exposed," is what he said to Hasbro's management in a typically military fashion, and even though this gamble could have bankrupted the company, Don Levine managed to convince Hasbro to proceed with the manufacture of the world's very first action figure for boys.
G.I. Joe, America's movable fighting man, the most realistic toy soldier the world has ever known. Army combat with G.I. Joe. Action soldier. Beachhead assault with G.I. Joe. Action marine. Underwater demolition with G.I. Joe. Action sailor. Air Force scramble with G.I. Joe. Action pilot. Over 1,000 fighting positions. And with the authentic G.I. Joe equipment available, you can bring a new kind of realism to playing soldier. Get G.I. Joe in the basic uniform and start collecting your G.I. Joe equipment today. It's a Hasbro toy.
Unveiled on February 2nd at New York's annual toy fair in 1964, the G.I. Joe product line was incredibly vast and featured a huge assortment of different figures and uniforms. The action soldiers could be decked out with combat jackets, rifles, backpacks, and machine guns, while the action sailors were equipped with semaphore flags, life jackets, and a shore patrol uniform. The Action Marines could prepare for an assault with a parachute pack set, or storm a beach with a flamethrower or fully loaded combat gear. And finally, the Action Pilots could scramble, and were also well prepared with their survival sets. The level of detailed craftsmanship incorporated into these toys still amazes me to this day, and I believe this commitment to high quality design quickly turned the G.I. Joe brand into an American cultural phenomenon. While sales of G.I. Joe action figures started off fairly slowly, most toy stores were completely out of stock by Christmas 1964, and the company's profits had tripled over the previous year. Throughout 1965, Hasbro released many newly designed uniforms for G.I. Joe, and these new sets were always based on American military uniforms, and this continued until 1966, when G.I. Joe attempted his first foray into non-American action figures with the introduction of the Soldiers of the World. What is quite unique about these foreign sets, apart from their handsomely designed uniforms and weapons, was the introduction of two completely new head sculpts, which no longer featured the trademark scar on G.I. Joe's cheek. 1966 was also the first year to see G.I. Joe licensed in a foreign country, being released in the United Kingdom as Palitoy's Action Man. In 1967, G.I. Joe produced the first ever talking G.I. Joe, and the Toyland's military theme continued to prove popular with the youth of America. That is, until the horrors of the Vietnam War began to play out nightly on the national news. By the late 1960s, the widespread opposition to the Vietnam War had ripped the country apart, and Hasbro started to see a rapid decline in their war-themed G.I. Joe products. So in 1969, G.I. Joe was first rebranded as The Adventures of G.I. Joe, and then in 1970, Hasbro went all out and launched the G.I. Joe Adventure Team.
There are 50 adventures for G.I. Joe. There are 50 adventures for your G.I. Joe with Kung Fu Grip, each sold separately. Here are 3. You can take Joe on patrol with Sandstorm Survival. And that's Joe with Secret Mission to Spy Island. Assemble Devil of the Deep and you can take Joe on a search for danger. There are 50 adventures for G.I. Joe.
Devil of the Deep comes with everything you see here. G.I. Joe with Kung Fu Grip, G.I. Joe adventure sets and equipment each sold separately.
The Adventure Team line saw G.I. Joe trekking through jungles, mountains and deserts on many exciting adventures, such as the White Tiger Hunt, the Search for the Stolen Idol, and the Secret of the Mummy's Tomb. G.I. Joe's Adventure Team was a huge commercial success and was further bolstered by Palitoy's Action Man innovations of Lifelike Hair in 1970 and Kung Fu Grip Hands in 1973. The Adventure Team would also see the introduction of other team members, including Mike Powers, the Atomic Man, and Bullet Man, the Human Bullet. The year 1976 saw the next Hasbro-designed figure innovation with the introduction of Eagle Eyes, but it was too little, too late. After 2 years of declining sales and the increased cost of petroleum-based plastic products, the original 12-inch G.I. Joe action figure line was eventually discontinued in 1977. A last-ditch effort in 1978 saw Hasbro shrink G.I. Joe down to a height of 8 inches, with the company renaming the figure Super Joe.
Introducing Super Joe Commander with the 1-2 punch. He also has a power-light vest, so you can imagine he's ready at night with a beam of light, 1 penlight battery not included. Imagine you can plug in this Super Joe sonic scanner to signal danger. Wherever there's trouble, day or night, you can imagine Super Joe will set things right. Super Joe Commander with the 1-2 punch, Super Joe sonic scanner, and Super Joe helipad, each sold separately, new from Hasbro.
But this smaller, cheaper version of the classic action figure failed to pique the interest of children, and it turned out to be a major commercial backfire. The demise of Super Joe officially killed the first generation of G.I. Joe action figures, and over the next few years, few people believed that they would ever see the brand return to toy store shelves. However, following the global success of Kenner's Star Wars action figures that were first released in 1978, designers at Hasbro set about reinventing Joe as a 3 3/4 inch figure line. The 3 3/4 inch scale was adopted to match the scale of the very popular Star Wars action figures, but Hasbro, believing that a lot of G.I. Joe's early success was due to his posability, designed the new Joe figures with a staggering amount of articulation. This smaller scale also made it possible for Hasbro to release a wide range of vehicles, something that was always extremely costly in the original 12-inch scale. Hasbro's designers astutely realised that articulation and scale alone would not be enough to ensure the success of G.I. Joe's relaunch. After all, the Star Wars toy line had been inspired by the highest grossing movie of all time, so just how would Hasbro get kids excited about a new G.I. Joe toy line? Enter Marvel Comics and the legendary writer Larry Hama, who breathed new life into G.I. Joe with what would go on to become one of the most popular comic books of the 1980s. One of the key differences with this new incarnation of G.I. Joe was that instead of Joe being an individual character, G.I. Joe was actually the code name for a team of guys. As Larry Hama began fleshing out the G.I. Joe comic backstory, he quickly realised that this daring, highly trained special mission force would need someone to fight. So Hasbro came up with the idea of Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organisation that was hell-bent on world domination, and Cobra also sported one of the best 80s logos ever designed.
It's G.I. Joe against Cobra the enemy. Don't let Cobra Commander get away! G.I. Joe!
It's Cobra Commander! He's stealing our missiles! Look, get him, rock and roll! Here comes Grand Slam!
Still fights for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe! American hero!
We saved the missiles! But you gotta get up early to catch Cobra!
Cobra Commander and G.I. Joe figures and equipment each sold separately from Hasbro.
This reimagined G.I. Joe toy line first hit store shelves in 1982, and it was incredibly popular, earning the company almost $50 million in profits. But Hasbro also realised that a comic book alone would not be enough to ensure the expanding success of this new brand. Fortunately for Hasbro though, in the early 1980s, US President Ronald Reagan effectively ended the regulation of children's television, and this, coupled with advances in animation technology, meant that G.I. Joe's new comic book could now be released as a cartoon. So, G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero was created by Hasbro Productions and was first aired on network television in 1983.
Yo, Joe! He'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe! Real American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra and Destro, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe!
The G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero cartoon introduced us to such iconic characters as Flint and Destro, General Hawk and Cobra Commander. But I feel its most ingenious conceptual idea came from Larry Hama's comic, when he tapped into the 80s ninja craze and came up with the idea of the Arashikage Ninja Clan, which boasted two of the most popular G.I. Joe characters of all time, Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow. Another aspect that made this new G.I. Joe toy line so memorable was the packaging art. Every single carded figure and boxed vehicle or playset was adorned with some of the most dynamic and exciting artwork ever designed for any toy line, and in addition to the beautiful illustrations, each carded figure came with a file card that were all written by Larry Hama and served to provide a backstory for each character. Hasbro's G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero was a runaway success, and the brand morphed into one of the most dominant toy lines of the decade. Although this new version of G.I. Joe was a scaled down version of his first incarnation, Hasbro never seemed to believe in the concept of scaling things down, and they went on to produce some of the biggest and best action figure toys of the 1980s.
Get the G.I. Joe hovercraft! Get the new Joes aboard!
G.I. Joe hovercraft holds 9 Joes. It's the big new way to bring the Joe team into action, and it floats on water.
Release depth charges! Yo, Joe!
A real American
Chase that Cobra! Way to go, Joe!
G.I. Joe hovercraft comes with driver, other figures, and equipment sold separately from Hasbro.
One of G.I. Joe's crowning achievements came in 1985, when Hasbro released the USS Flag aircraft carrier, which to this day is still the largest action figure playset ever created. From its inception in 1982, the G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero toy line continued to grow in popularity with every passing year, culminating in 1987 with the animated film G.I. Joe the Movie. This film was intended to have a theatrical release, closely followed by Transformers the Movie. However, the G.I. Joe film encountered a series of unexpected production delays, which meant that the Transformers feature film was released first, and due to this movie's poor performance at the box office, G.I. Joe the Movie was instead relegated to a direct-to-video release on VHS. By the time the public first saw G.I. Joe the Movie, the storyline had begun to move away from the somewhat reality-based early stories, and was now heading in a more fantastical direction, with the introduction of characters such as Serpentor, Cobra's supreme leader. This movie is also noteworthy for introducing the real-life wrestling character of Sergeant Slaughter to the G.I. Joe team, a character played by Robert Remus. Sergeant Slaughter was not the first real-world character to join the G.I. Joe team. In the previous year, G.I. Joe had also enlisted the Fridge into their ranks, a character that was also based on another real-world personality, the football player William the Refrigerator Perry. Although Hasbro's G.I. Joe A Real American Hero action figure line became one of the biggest toy successes of the 80s, history was destined to repeat itself, and by 1989 sales had once again begun to decline. So in 1991, Hasbro decided to appease fans when they re-released G.I. Joe in his original 12-inch format for the first time in 12 years.
G.I. Joe doesn't get any bigger than this. The G.I. Joe Hall of Fame collection. Duke, Stalker, Snake Eyes, and Cobra Commander. Each 12 inches tall and authentically detailed, from Duke's lifelike hair to Cobra Commander's boots. They've got cloth uniforms, metal dog tags, and accessories like weapons cases and combat helmets. And each numbered collector's edition is armed with an awesome light and sound weapon. For really big action, Cobra Commander, Snake Eyes, Stalker, and Duke sold separately from the G.I. Joe Hall of Fame collection. A whole new way to play.
The reinvented 3 3/4-inch G.I. Joe A Real American Hero toy line lasted an impressive 12 years, finally ended production in 1994. But the reintroduction of the 12-inch line continued to prove popular with adult collectors, as Hasbro released new product lines such as the Classic Collection, which ran from 1995 to 2004. Since 1994, G.I. Joe has never strayed too far away from toy store shelves, being released in one form or another right up to the present day, including a 25th anniversary series that was initially released in 2007. In 2009, the highly respected collectible action figure company Sideshow began releasing their own versions of 12-inch tall G.I. Joe action figures. These amazingly well-detailed figures offered new interpretations of the key characters, and the range also included some truly amazing diorama pieces to help collectors display their figures in quintessential G.I. Joe environments. The same year also saw the theatrical release of the movie G.I. Joe The Rise of Cobra, and although it wasn't exactly a hit with the critics, it made enough money to warrant a sequel. In 2013, G.I. Joe Retaliation was released in cinemas, starring Bruce Willis and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. G.I. Joe Retaliation was a commercial smash hit, so there are now plans to film a third movie entitled G.I. Joe Ever Vigilant, which has a scheduled release date of 2020. We deliberately decided to film this special edition video tribute to G.I. Joe in 2019, the same year which would see the 55th anniversary of this legendary action figure toy line. And even after honourably serving a career that has spanned 5.5 decades, it seems this American hero is destined to continue the fight for many generations to come. As I look back now, I realise that my YouTube channel wouldn't even exist if it weren't for G.I. Joe. My childhood passion for collecting toys started with Action Man, G.I. Joe's British cousin, and this childhood passion even inspired me to join the British Army and serve in the Iraq War. G.I. Joe's legacy is far more than that of a simple childhood favourite toy line. G.I. Joe's identity as a noble hero has grown over the years, and he has become a role model for children all over the world, and these wonderful toys have always been there for us. G.I. Joe will always remain a cut above the other action figures in the toy chest, having been developed with a real passion for quality and also being created by some of the best action figure designers the world has ever seen. G.I. Joe isn't just a real American hero, he's a real childhood hero, and now you know his true history, and knowing is half the battle.